Let's get started. Good morning again, everybody. I want to be respectful of those who join on time, and we only have 1 hour for this very interesting conversation. So let's go ahead with it. My name is Eguiar Lizundia, and I'm IRI's Deputy Director for Technical Advancement based in Washington, D.C., from where I'm speaking right now. I'm very thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this panel that marks the official launch of IRI's anti-corruption toolkit for civic activists, which the Institute developed in partnership with experts from both within and outside IRI, some of them who are here with us today. So a warm welcome to them and to all of you, especially those of you joining from overseas. As many as you know, tomorrow we commemorate International Anti-Corruption Day, which is always a good opportunity to reflect on corruption trends, as well as share information on what can help in the fight against graft, abuse, and kleptocracy more broadly. One method or approach that the literature and the evidence has demonstrated as effective is empowering civic actors. And IRI's toolkit provides activists with some proven strategies to push back against corrupt practices. So today I'm joined by 3 anti-corruption experts who were part of the development of this resource and who will be discussing different aspects of it, as well as putting the toolkit in the broader context. In terms of the structure of this conversation, each of our 3 panelists will be providing some initial remarks for approximately 10 minutes. We will then open it up for questions. But please note that although this is being streamlined on Facebook Live on IRI's Facebook page, we will not be able to take any questions from Facebook directly. Instead, those wishing to submit a question may do so by privately messaging the account called Q&A in the Zoom chat. So without further ado, let me turn over to our panelists, let me introduce them first, and then we'll have the opportunity to hear from each one of them. Our first panelist is my colleague, Milica Djuric. Milica is a governance specialist at IRI's Center for Global Impact, where she focuses on anti-corruption. Prior to joining IRI, Milica worked on counterterrorism for the government of Serbia, where she studied the links between terrorism and organized crime. Milica will provide an overview of the toolkit, which is accessible online via IRI's website. We will also drop the link in the chat so people can access it directly through here. And we will then turn it to Dr. Renad Mansour, who is a senior research fellow and project director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. His research explores the political economy of corruption reform and state building in Iraq and the broader Middle East. He's also a senior research fellow at the American University of Iraq, Soleimani. Welcome, Dr. Mansour. Last but not least, we will have Aiman Rasheed, who recently joined IRI as senior program manager in the Maldives. Before that, he was the executive director at Transparency International Maldives, which is the local chapter of Transparency International. And this was at the time we were developing the toolkit. So welcome and thank you all of you for being with us here today. Milica, the virtual floor is yours. Seems like Milica is having some trouble unmuting. Hopefully we will be able to, I think, there you go. You are muted now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Apologies about the technical difficulties. So once again, thank you so much, Eguiar, and thank you to everyone joining us for this event. As Eguiar mentioned, the International Anti-Corruption Day is a great opportunity for us to reflect on the corruption trends. And unfortunately, over the last decade, high-level corruption and kleptocratic regimes have been on the rise, and they are exercising growing influence around the world. And this is a great opportunity for us to pause and reflect on what are the implications of this trend and how can we mitigate its negative effects. So first of all, let's begin by briefly explaining what exactly kleptocracy means. Kleptocracy is theft of a nation's resources happening at the highest level of government. So the powerful few who are at the very top are abusing their political power to loot the country's resources to their own benefit and distribute these resources to the closest network of their trusted allies. These immense resources, this immense wealth that they accumulate is frequently stored in accounts abroad, most frequently actually in Western bank accounts. And this wealth is money that is directly stolen from their country's citizens, from the citizens' pockets. According to some estimates, about $1 trillion of stolen money flows out of the developing countries every year. So $1 trillion represents hundreds of thousands of individual crimes from the developing countries, each of which left their countries of origin a little more impoverished and a little more unstable. And this immense money are resources that could have been used to build schools, hospitals, buy medicine. And especially during a global pandemic, it is important to highlight this problem and understand that no country in the world, and especially not developing countries, can afford the opportunities costs of this high level of sophisticated theft. So understanding all that, let's talk a bit about how can we stop this complicated problem. And for this, we look towards civil society. Around the world for decades as well, for as long as this problem has existed, civil society has been around as well, identifying, exposing, and countering this problem. Unsurprisingly, at the same time, kleptocrats around the world have been very active at targeting civil society and trying to impair their ability to identify and expose corruption. And most importantly, also trying to impair their ability to organize around advocating against it. And another sad trend that is important to mention here is that in a growing number of countries around the world, harassment against civil society has been on the rise as well, which often includes a variety of human rights abuses, imprisonment, and sadly, sometimes even disappearances and torture. But good news for us is that civil society, despite all these immense risks to personal safety and fears of imprisonment and violence, civil society remains determined to fight against high-level corruption. And to be successful in this very difficult mission, they need to be ever more resilient in the face of security risks, and they need to adopt new skills and implement innovative approaches. And to help them, to equip them in this important mission, IRI has developed this toolkit. The toolkit is a comprehensive compilation of tools, strategies, and tips for civil society activists around the world to equip them to identify and expose corruption, but also organize and form successful alliances and coalitions to work together and amplify each other's efforts in countering high-level corruption. Also, how to advocate, build successful agendas for reform, and finally, how to engage with the media and successfully reach decision makers. Now that sounds like a lot, but the contents of the toolkit were developed by a cross-country assessment of existing civil society capacity around the world. And its 3 modules reflect the 3 areas of key need for capacity building. So for example, the first module is focused on research methods and security. And this module has very concrete tips and strategies on how to conduct thorough research and identify corruption, but also very importantly, as hinted earlier, how to stay safe while doing so. So it covers in detail understanding security risks and using advanced digital tools to remain safe and anonymous online. Its second module is focused on advocacy, collaboration, and setting priorities. And it includes strategies on how to form a strong coalition, a coalition that's diverse and includes organizations that bring a variety of viewpoints, but most importantly, also skill sets that can amplify each other's efforts and help galvanize more public attention, and how to design a successful reform agenda and advocate on it. And lastly, the toolkit's third module is focused on communications and media. And it provides very concrete guidance on writing press releases, policy papers, and it includes tips on working with the media and effectively reaching policymakers. So far, IRI has piloted this toolkit in 3 countries, including Iraq, Mali, and the Maldives. And our other 2 panelists, Dr. Mansour and Aiman, will expand a bit on that and the anti-corruption trainings that we delivered. But going forward, our goal is to disseminate the toolkit as broadly as possible and to translate it to multiple languages, to make it available to civil society around the world and to equip them with the key skills that we had identified are needed to help them be successful in their mission. And I believe at this point, Egyar dropped the link for our full toolkit, if you're curious to see it in more detail, in the chat. But also, if you are interested in learning more about it or directly working with us on implementing some of its parts or all of it in your country, please do not hesitate to reach out to us as well. We would be very happy to help. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining this event, and I very much look forward to answering any questions you may have in the Q&A portion.
Thank you so much, Milica, for that overview of the toolkit, as well as the broader reflection of what's happening in anti-corruption space and what are some of the challenges that civil society is facing around the world. Let's now turn over to Dr. Mansour, who's now going to provide some remarks on the issue we're discussing today, as well as his, some reflection on his experience with the toolkit, including some research projects led by civil society that he mentored. Dr. Mansour, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and for having me. So I've been asked to kind of go over some of this, the work in Iraq, but more generally how, the way we're looking at the space of policy, the space of reform vis-a-vis corruption. And I thought it would be important to begin by telling a kind of story of Iraqi protesters, which some of you may have heard about in October 2019, going to the streets of Baghdad's Tahrir Square and many other provinces in the south of the country, where they faced the violence that was discussed previously. And they still went out. And when they went to the streets for months and months, they actually camped out in these public squares. They had one message, which was that we are tired of this entire system. So they weren't against one political leader or one political party, but they were against the system, which they sort of symbolize as being, through corruption. In fact, one of the slogans was corruption equals terrorism. The corrupt is the terrorist. In this way, and this is something that they've been saying for several years, even when the Islamic State conquered 1/3 of their country. So corruption is very much on the agenda of civil society activists and protesters. And in 2019 until today, they have faced adversary, repression, assassinations, but they still want this message to get out. And so how does that message get out? And I think it's first important to note that this is an Iraq that was meant to be democratized after 2003. And in fact, all of the so-called tools of democracy, elections, representation, quota systems to bring different sects and ethnicities together have actually been part of facilitating the corruption rather than democratizing, right? So there has been something that hasn't worked for the last 18 years in the story of Iraq. And I think there are lessons that could be learned. I think the point is to differentiate 2 types of corruption. So the one that people often focus on isn't the one that those protesters were talking about, but it's that corruption that's primarily personal greed. So at the top level, it's contract fraud and someone trying to make extra money using a position. And at the very low level, of course, it's bribes. In Arabic, there's even a word, wasta, which is if you have you have some kind of connections, bakshish, you pay a bribe and you're able to get things done. That's where the focus has been. However, the work that we were doing, working with policy researchers and civil society organizations in Iraq, was to kind of take that, but also focus on a different type of corruption, which is actually the political system, an unaccountable political system where political parties across Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, other group, political parties, are actually all working together in an elite pact where they split the national pie of the country. And it's that corruption that is actually the root of the incoherence of the state, and also the root of all the other corruption that we focus on. So that greed is a symptom, a byproduct of that much bigger corruption, which is Iraq, a very wealthy state where budgets can go up to $100 trillion a year, or 100 billion. And a rentier state with oil, and how the elite need to be part of that government. So then the question became, how do we kind of look at that bigger corruption, and how does that move towards reform? And of course, there were two ways. The one way, which has been mentioned already, is that idea of exposing the system, which is helpful because many people don't actually know the extent to which the political parties are making money, all of their assets, both in the country and out of the country, and all of that greed that we talked about. But then there was that sort of longer term, and this is really where we focused. How do you take that information? How do you take what we know to be true, but now you have the facts, and harness it in a way towards strengthening reform? And that's where the policy analysis comes in. So it's part investigative journalism, which allows for an understanding of, well, who is exactly stealing what. But the policy angle is, well, what do you do? Bar revolution, which is what the protesters are calling for, how do you actually reform a political system that's become so rotten that it's the way politics works? And so that became the focus of the work that we did with CSOs, is to partly bring out the information, but also map. And we actually preferred using the words, partly because of the sensitivities around the world corruption, right? Because the thing about corruption is when you begin doing research on it in these contexts where you're in an elite pact that's based on corruption, you're not going to have any allies in the system. You're going to have a lot of enemies. And so we went for a word that was perhaps less antagonistic, which was barriers to reform. And of course, corruption being the barrier to reform. And then moving from that, how do you map the system? How do you map the state? How do you map all the political parties, where they have influence, in which ministries do they have civil servants that are providing them with the contracting that they need, in which commissions throughout the state, both at the national level, but also at the local levels, an electricity administrative body in a municipality is also a profit rent generating mechanism for the political parties. So this corruption is endemic, and it's prolific, and it's across the country. But then not just mapping the corruption, but also mapping those who are in the system, but who may be those kind of champions for some kind of reform. Because what you have are reformists, both inside and outside the system. But how do you strengthen the connective tissues of reform to begin to push back against that big elite pact? And so, that was based on the methodologies of interviewing, of trying to find variables that we could test. What does reform look like? What does effectiveness look like? And we use a lot of indicators, governance indicators, for example. But also, how do you write this out so that it's not just information, but there's some kind of analysis to it, and also a link to big concepts, whether that's poverty, elections. The role of elections in corruption is very important. The role of the role of reconciliation in corruption is very important. And so how do you take the big concepts, link it to corruption, and then offer some kind of policy recommendations for both for the governments of Iraq, but also for international actors seeking to work to strengthening reform, moving towards reform in Iraq. And so to conclude then, I think I just go back to that point where this is a sort of our short-term and long-term tactics in this. This is policy analysis. This is meant to give recommendations, and it's very difficult and obviously very sensitive, but it is something that I think civil societies do have a role in doing and require training both in methodologies of political science as well as investigative journalism's academic and non-academic, and also the ability to be able to communicate effectively and to come up with ideas of reforming within that system. I'll leave it at there and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mansour. A very fascinating overview of some of the challenges that civil society, but in general anti-corruption performance face, which is the identification of what are the veto players, but also what are the reformers and how can we bridge the gaps between those inside and outside government to move the needle towards greater transparency and accountability. Hopefully during the Q&A, we can hear about more, what were some of the findings that the groups you were working with were able to identify, and whether that maybe serves as an example, or there are some experiences there that could be helpful to others who are joining us from all over the world. So our last speaker is Aiman Rasheed, who will also be discussing his experience working with civil society in addressing these delicate issues of tackling entrenched corruption, and hopefully also will be able to share some reflections on his experience applying these techniques that we're discussing today. So Aiman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agura. Before I get to the actual sharing experiences working with civil society on issues of corruption, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context, because usually when you Google Maldives on the internet, you probably see this fascinating, beautiful chains of islands, turquoise white beaches, turquoise oceans, water that you can see like 30 meters down. It's so clear, and it's so far removed from the lived reality of the Maldivians. What the tourists see and what you see on the internet is really, really very different from what the Maldivians and the average Maldivian experiences in their daily lives. So just to provide a little bit of context, Maldives held its first ever multi-party presidential elections in 2008. Just over a decade ago, and this was following years of protest and civic action by a number of organizations and individuals. Prior to 2005, the civic action, political action, any sort of activism was completely banned. There's just one TV station in the Maldives, just one radio station, and the president had been in power for 25 years by then, 27 years to be exact by then. So the civic space in the Maldives was very, very limited. So the Maldives is just emerging from a culture of authoritarianism, a culture where nobody was allowed to speak. So everything that people know about society is how to be, for the most part, obedient, for the most part, be proud of their country. And so when civil society organizations, when the people who are trying to achieve good governance, when they speak out there, that's often labeled as outcasts. Just to provide a brief overview, during the past 12 years, even after the first multi-party presidential elections in 2008, of the 4 presidents we've had, 3 or 4 presidents have been imprisoned. Of the 5 chief justices we've had 5 chief justices during a short period of 13 years, and all of these chief justices were supposed to be there for life. So you can see just how stable our political situation is. And also, I think one way to sort of visualize corruption in the Maldives is the Maldives has a CPI score of 130, but it doesn't reflect the actual corruption in the country. While corruption is often, especially in this region in the world, corruption is often understood as bribery, the Maldives' bribery rate is very low. For example, if you look at the Global Corruption Barometer research of Transparency International, in the region, you'll find bribery rates anywhere between 33% to 80% across Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, India. But in the Maldives, the bribery rate is 3 to 6%, which is very low. But Maldives has very high incidence of corruption. So it's not petty corruption that's prevalent in the Maldives. It's grand corruption, the sort of corruption where the parliament, the judiciary, the political actors, the president, and the elite of the country scheme together to control the resources of the country. Iraq has its oil, Maldives has its beaches, Maldives has its reefs, Maldives has its natural beauty, and that's what the political elites seek to control through corruption. Recently, you may have heard that the Maldives, a huge corruption scandal rocked the Maldives about 3 years ago, where over 3 billion Maldivian rupiah was siphoned off through fire sale of lagoons and islands by then Vice President under the former regime. Only 2 people have been jailed even after the government changed, because everyone in the country, all of the major political actors, all of the political parties, all of the elite in the country, all of these groups benefited from this corruption. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to fight corruption in the country. It's because all of these have all of the powerful individuals in the country have a finger in the pie, in the corruption pie. So it becomes really, really hard to address corruption in the country. And I think it's also one of the, there are other social factors, remnants of authoritarianism that prevent civil society from advocating for good governance, human rights, and anti-corruption efforts. And one of the main reasons is that politics is strictly viewed as the domain of certain people, right? Of certain elite people. So when a common person wants to comment on corruption, on the way the country is run, they're viewed as being political, and being political is very, very dangerous in the country. So from that perspective, civil society organizations, many civil society organizations don't want to engage in any action, any activity that is viewed as political in the country. And even commenting to a law, having comments on, for example, how an institution is functioning, that can be also political. So it's extremely dangerous to work in the civic space in the country. But what's really interesting in the Maldives is we have, it's a really small country. It's just about half a million individuals across 200 communities separated by oceans. So there are over 4,000 civil society organizations registered in the country. So that's about one civil society organization per 100 people. And you would assume that this high number of civil society organizations in the country sort of signify that there's very high civic activity and civic participation. Unfortunately, that's not true. These civil society organizations are very limited in their functions and in their ability to fight corruption, because 1, they don't have the tools, and 2, the understanding of their role is very limited. So these organizations, they view themselves as community-based organizations for the most part, and they work at community level, cleaning roads, doing small projects in their communities. But very few of these organizations actually participate in advocacy, public relations, network building, and working with state institutions, even when they're requested to work with the few state institutions that are open to working with them. So one of the main takeaways from the training program that we had for civil society organizations on the anti-corruption toolkit is that it began to challenge what civil society can do and what civil society can be. So just from being a community-based organization to taking control of the civic space that is available with the democratization process, I think that's one of the main takeaways from the training program. And for civil society organizations to recognize that there's a role for them to play in the democratization process, and they can be empowered by tools that are available now, and that there are organizations in the country that can help them achieve some of the objectives that they have for their own communities and in the areas that they work in. So these are some of the comments I wanted to share with the participants of this discussion. I also want to share some of the statistics from the training program itself, and where we found that 78% of the civil society organizations said that they found the content very useful. And 83% of the organizations that participate in the trainings reported that they learned something new. And 100% of the organizations that participate in the training said they gained new information that they plan to use in conducting the business of their organizations. And I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have regarding civil society in the Maldives.
Thank you so much, Aiman. That was definitely a very interesting presentation. I'm sure there'll be questions, and we'll get into those in a minute. I just want to highlight something that you said towards the end, which is this idea of civics activists and civil society organizations taking control over the democratic space that is now available to them, and how critical that is in making sure that they can provide the type of checks and balances and the type of monitoring that government needs to make sure that we reduce the room for corruption. Another element that I found very interesting from your presentation just now is this idea that while the Maldives might not seem to have much in common with Iraq, in the sense that there is no oil, tourism and natural beauty is also a form of commodity. And in many ways, it makes the country subject to the same problems of frontier states, like Dr. Mansour was saying. So fascinating information. Let's now turn it over to the Q&A. As a reminder, you can submit questions through sending a direct message to the Q&A account or participant on the chat feature. We can only accept questions submitted directly to excuse me, the Q&A participant, and then please have a name as you submit your question associated to your account. I'm trusting that most people are familiar with the logistics of writing on a Zoom chat, but you can click on the three dotted on the upper left hand corner of your Zoom window, and hopefully that will be easy enough to do. Otherwise, I'm happy to ask some follow-up, but I want to give it just a couple of seconds as people are typing up to make sure that we give due deference to our participants. All right, since it seems that we don't have any questions as of yet, I had one question for Milica that I was hoping that you could maybe help us, help the audience get a better understanding of what is innovative and different about the toolkit that we're presented today, and how can it benefit the anti-corruption community at large?
Sure, thank you for that question, Aguiar. So what we identified as a need, what motivated us to develop this toolkit, is that there was no centralized resource that was easily available to activists around the world to build skills in the key areas that would equip them to be successful in identifying and exposing high-level corruption. So to do this, as I mentioned earlier, we conducted a cross-country analysis of civil society capacity. And what this means, we conducted interviews with civil society in Iraq and the Maldives and assessed thoroughly what are the existing levels of skills that they have and what are the areas of need for improvement. So based on this, what's unique about this toolkit is that it is tailored to address the specific needs of activists in the field. It was not made by people in DC brainstorming on what are the needs of civil society in the world. It is designed to address the specific needs, the actual needs of people fighting corruption. Additionally, one thing that we noticed while doing this analysis is that the level of skill really varies. So in some countries, the ability to research corruption is very basic, while in others, it's pretty advanced, but they may need some innovative skills, or perhaps they'll need to focus on safety. So we were very careful in designing this toolkit to begin by covering some basic concepts, and then advance towards the more innovative tools that will be a value add to civil society that has been already doing this work for a very long time. And another thing that we constantly had in mind is to make the toolkit really adaptive to a variety of contexts. So we made sure to pilot it in the 3 countries, and we will continue to do that in many other countries where we are present. And we continually received feedback and made sure to incorporate this feedback and make sure that its contents really speak to the needs of people in the field. So we already made this toolkit public, and we will continue to disseminate it and adapt it to different contexts as we move forward with it.
Great, thank you so much, Milica. We have a question from our colleague Mohanad Adnan from IRA Iraq to Dr. Mansour. And I think this is a very relevant aspect that it's always important to discuss when addressing or having a conversation around corruption, which is the risks, the security risks that come with investigating corruption in Iraq. Dr. Mansour, if you have anything to say to that, what are some of the risks for activists and how can those be mitigated?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Mohammed. Nice to see you online. Yeah, I mean, I mean, Mohammed knows the risks quite well. I mean, the issue in Iraq on corruption, as I said, is you're not talking about going against one party with the top cover of another party. You're exposed yourself as a civil society activist or organization. You will have the entire weight of the system come down on you from the armed groups, both inside the government and outside the government, that work to protect the political system, all the way up to all the political parties, even those that claim to be reformist or claim to be liberal. You have in Iraq the language of reform, and people, all the leaders claim to be reformists. But if they find out that there is a group or a journalist who is working on one of the issues of corruption, and corruption is heavily militarized at times in Iraq, it is all linked to the security, the politics, and the economics, they will come down. And there have been, in the past year, researchers assassinated, activists put in jail, and effectively creating a kind of environment of fear. And I engage with many researchers across the country, and you have to be very careful. Again, as I mentioned, in the type of words you're using, you know, sometimes you don't want to use the word corruption. You might want to use a different word, as I said, barriers to reform, keeping it general. But also in what the net outcome is in this. If it is just to expose, then it needs to be much more careful than it is, as I say, just to talk about reform. So to answer the question then, the risks are big, and those are physical risks. Of course, then there becomes, let's say, research risks, which is different, because this information nobody knows. There isn't a database. There isn't, you can't go to the investment commission. You can't go to any of the government bureaucracies to try and find out what is true and what is not true. It's all based on word of mouth. And so in that, what becomes important with working with civil society is to begin to bring in methodologies of corroboration and triangulation, and to make sure that the information is in fact correct and not slander or not given to you to try and bring some other person down in that way, not politicized. So there are many risks, both to the safety of the researchers as well as to the analysis and research, let's say.
Thank you, Dr. Mansour. I feel like this question is also pertinent to the Maldives. Anything to add in terms of the security risks that come with investigating or doing anti-corruption work?
Absolutely. The situation has radically improved in the country following the change of regime about 2 years ago. But prior to that, colleagues have been, we've had forced disappearances, we've had murders in the country, and the the effect of these murders, forced disappearances is very chilling. For example, in my family, my sister is a journalist. She worked with Al Jazeera to produce a documentary on how some of the funds in the Maldives are stolen and then taken out of the country through corrupt means, and she had to flee the country for fear of her life. And the former Auditor General of the country who brought to light some of the systemic issues in the government with respect to siphoning off of money had to flee the country as well. As he boarded the plane, the courts presented an order for him to be arrested, but fortunately he was able to leave the country before the order could be presented because he was on the plane by then. So there are many instances where civil society organizations, journalists, individuals who have been brave enough to speak out against corruption have faced threats to their lives and physical violence. But the situation has improved since then. Because there's very little state-sponsored and sanctioned violence. However, there are still individuals and groups who are very powerful and still want to silence any chatter when it comes to corruption. And then the government, while previous governments have engaged in physical threats and intimidation in the past, the system works very differently now in the sense even the current government and politicians still practice different forms of intimidation. It can be in the form of incentives. For example, if you work in a media organization, because the government controls all of the sectors, they can really squeeze a media organization in the sense a lot of the media organizations in the Maldives depend on external funding for them to be able to function. This external funding, external revenue comes in the form of advertising revenue, and the government spends on these advertising revenue the most. For example, state-owned enterprises play a huge role in the Maldivian economy, and the vast majority of the procurement that the state conducts is conducted through the state-owned enterprises, and this is how the government is then able to control the media by controlling how the media gets funds. And the existence of media is therefore dependent on whether or not the media pleases the state and toes the line that the state wants the media to toe. So that there are different methods. It's different from previous governments, but it still exists. And on many corruption issues, people just prefer to not engage because of the threats to their lives, to their livelihoods, to their future.
Thank you, man. I think you make a very important point, which is beyond the physical risks that engaging in corruption sometimes entails. There is the issue of the risk in terms of losing one's livelihood and in general, the different ways governments or states can make sure that any anti-corruption work is suppressed or disencouraged by using different methods that are becoming more and more sophisticated. We have a couple of questions from Willis, who's implementing a project aimed at engaging young people in the fight against corruption in partnership with Ford Foundation. They want to know how the trainings around the toolkit happen. So maybe Milica or Aiman, if you could take that one. And then for Dr. Mansour, they wanted to know how can the fight against corruption be linked to key moments like elections? What should happen around the electoral cycle?
Sure, I would be happy to take the first part of the question. And thank you for that question, Willis. This would be a great opportunity to partner. We will be very happy to help you with the trainings. In addition to the toolkit, which you can examine in the link in the chat box, it is organized in 3 modules. And each module usually takes about an hour in training. We have been pretty successful at delivering the trainings virtually, But one thing that I would also point out is that in addition to the actual toolkit, we also have fully fleshed out training materials that we would be happy to share with you. We would also be happy to deliver the trainings ourselves. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us directly for more questions about this. This toolkit would be, although it was designed for perhaps for civil society activists, and it can benefit the more advanced activists who have a lot of experience, it would also speak and be interested to youth activists, and has a lot of useful tools on how to be engaged online, how to galvanize public's attention, and was written in a language that would be very accessible to youth as well. So please do not hesitate to reach out with any more detailed questions. I'm not sure if Aiman would like to share any experiences from delivering the toolkits, as he delivered some of the trainings himself.
Sure. I think what I found, well, what participants said they found the most useful was we were able to invite a number of civil society organizations and individuals from Malaysia to share their experiences with respect to how they've been successful in advocating for anti-corruption, specifically in the 1MDB scandal, where billions of dollars was stolen from Malaysia. So how the civil society organizations worked, well, how they coordinated, how they found allies, how they worked within the system, what challenges that they faced. So that I think was super useful. And perhaps it would be easier to sort of ground any training in a very concrete example from the country or from the region. I think that would be super useful. But beyond that, I found that some of the civil society organizations found some of the concepts very alien to them, because they didn't think that, for example, it was the role of civil society organizations to conduct advocacy. So, so there was an element of also training civil society organizations on what civic space is, what civil society organization can do, and that that there is a lot that can be done when civil society work together. And beyond that, I think that the example from Malaysia was super useful, because we had a number of civil society organizations from Malaysia, including Transparency International Malaysia, speak about how they built networks and how they work together, and how they capitalized on the comparative strengths of different organizations. Some organizations may have higher research capacity, whereas some organizations may have very strong grassroots networks. Some organizations may be really, really good at media and public relations work. So the combination of all of these groups together and the networks together, that they had a huge impact. And the fact that, for example, it was not just civil society organizations, and the nexus between civic and political action, and jumping from civic action and having an impact on the politics through civic action, I think that was super useful. And that's something that the Maldivian and civil society organizations found really interesting, because this is all new information and new ways of using civic space to affect politics.
Should I answer the question that was addressed? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. And actually, it goes back to the question that you asked, Edward, sort of in the middle, which was what were some of the findings from the what we did a few months ago in Iraq. And on the question of elections, when you have a country based on this, what's called this kind of like patrimonial system, which means that all the political parties, they cooperate, they take a share of the pie, and they split that pie to develop their social base. Most people are outside of that system, and they don't have the options. They don't have their own political parties. There's no other way to do politics outside of those political parties that control the system, which means that what they do instead is not vote. And in the last election in 2018, Iraq had its lowest voter turnout since 2003. And although it was officially at 44%, people say the government had inflated that, and it's probably around 20% or lower. So what's happening is more and more people are not in that patronage networks. More and more people aren't part of the base of the social elite, sorry, of the elite. So what the Iraqi leaders did after 2003 was try and take as much money out of the government and to create these patronage networks. So any ministry, for example, the Ministry of Electricity, right? In 2003, when the US and their allies invaded, had about 27,000 employees. By now, it has 130,000 employees. However, most will tell you that the electricity has not improved in Iraq. But what does that mean? That means that the political parties took their people, offered them state employment in exchange for votes, in exchange for support. That's how politics works. What's happening now is Iraq has the highest birth rate in the region, which means more and more kids are being born outside of the system, and now they're growing up. So each year you're going to get louder protests and louder louder accusations of not having a job, of not having a livelihood. And part of that is being harnessed through the protest movements. But one thing that they've all learned is that if you want change, you don't go to the ballot box, because you don't have an option for a genuine political party that can actually change something. There have been parties that have emerged out of protests, but the minute they've gone into the government, they've then become part of that same system. So there's a loss in faith, and elections are viewed as reinforcing corruption. And I think that is why they're deciding not to vote, which is why, again, the only real space they have to have a voice is through this civic space and through the civil society and through building these communities outside. And so I think this will move on more and more, but the consequence of that will be more violence from the political system as they're unable to maintain this base.
Thank you, Dr. Mansour, for that reflection and the somber, perhaps, analysis of what can happen as the political system doesn't provide the avenues for people to engage and to address these deeply rooted issues that we're talking about of corruption. I know that Aiman also has experience and working around elections and sort of providing advice and leadership on what to do to try to address corruption through the ballot box. So Aiman, if you can share also your thoughts on this important question.
Sure, thanks. Dr. Mansour, your insights, I mean, the parallels that we can draw to the Maldives, it's uncanny, really. So there are some differences, but so many similarities. The first difference is the Maldives has really high voter turnout. We have voter turnout anywhere between 85 to 92%, and this isn't inflated. This is really accurate voter turnout figures, which is really amazing considering the fact that elections in the Maldives are so corrupt. But it's also amazing that about 80 to 90% of the Maldivians feel, as per the Global Corruption Barometer research in the Maldives, feel that they can have an impact on the state of corruption in the country. But the main point that I wanted to make is the corruption in elections is very much institutionalized now. It's not outside the system. The political actors have found ways to use the system to sort of perpetuate corruption. I'd also want to reference a statement Dr. Mansour made earlier, where he said that the very systems that were supposed to provide democracy have sort of been used and have been subverted to perpetuate corruption. And that's the case in the Maldives as well. We had our first multi-party presidential elections in 2008, and there was a lot of hope in the country, but nothing positive really came of these supposedly free and fair elections. In the Maldives, up to 38% of the people have reported that they've engaged in bribery in elections. And in the Maldives, this is especially acute because it's a very small population, one, and the constituencies are really small, and we've had parliamentarians winning their seats, about 20-30% of parliamentarians winning their seats by a difference of less than 100 votes. And that is where money in politics plays a really crucial role, because whoever has money can then control elections, because even one vote is really, really powerful. And also to and one of the things, again, Dr. Mansour said with respect to these systems of patronage where political parties use existing state machinery to sort of reward their supporters, and that's very prevalent in the Maldives too. So the Maldivian civil service is at about 10% of the voting population, and the state-owned enterprises is where, whenever a government comes in, that's where all of the political party activists and in the communities where there are so few jobs, it is these political activists and individuals connected to these political parties who are given jobs with fat salaries, while people who study hard, who work, and who don't want to be part of this corrupt system, they just don't have any sort of avenue for them to be able to progress through the system. So there are many, many similarities, and there are very, very well, similarities and differences as well. But I think one of the main things that I found really interesting is the fact that the very democratic systems that were supposed to bring in hope and good sort of things to the system have actually been subverted by the elite of the country for their own benefit.
Thank you so much, Aiman, for those additional thoughts and that reality that sometimes the democratic process has unintended consequences, and we put a lot of faith, especially as IRI being a democracy assistance organization in the democratic process, but we can be naive and think that democracy alone is going to resolve all of the challenges, especially in the anti-corruption field. We only have a minute left. I want to acknowledge those who had questions that we won't have time to answer. Christopher Wom had us about what procedures do we need to follow to have access to the training that we offer. Milica covered this earlier. You have the toolkit that you can access online, but we would encourage you to get in touch with us as we can provide advice on how to implement those trainings, as well as perhaps even help with the delivery themselves. I wanted to thank our panelists for spending the time with us today. I think it was a very rich conversation. We covered a lot of ground, from patronage and clientelism around in the government to how kleptocrats have outsmarting sometimes activists. But I think that the message that we want to emphasize is that in countries where there is opening for civil society to be active, really empowering them and having a civic activist environment and ecosystem that is thriving and that is investigating and exposing and keeping government in check can really make a difference. Thank you, everybody, also our participants from all over the world, and we hope to see you soon.